The morning mist clung to the settlement like death itself, and through it came the sound that made every soul freeze, the rhythmic thunder of hooves against hard earth, dozens of them, maybe more. Young Timothy pressed his back against the wooden wall of the orphanage, his small fists clutching the empty space where his carved wooden horse once lived. The other children had scattered like leaves before a storm, but he remained, watching as shadows emerged from the gray dawn. Warriors on painted horses, their faces unreadable as stone, their eyes scanning the buildings with the patience of hunters. At their head rode an elder whose silver hair caught what little light pierced the morning gloom. The man's weathered hand rested on something wrapped in deerskin, and when his gaze found Timothy through the mist, the boy's breath caught in his throat. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie for generations to come.
2 days earlier, Timothy had been nothing more than another forgotten soul in a place where forgotten souls gathered to wait for nothing. The Mercy Creek orphanage sat at the edge of civilization like a last prayer whispered into an indifferent sky, housing 23 children whose stories all began with loss and seemed destined to end the same way. Timothy, at barely 8 years old, had already learned that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. His days followed the same pattern: morning chores before dawn, lessons with Sister Margaret, who spoke of God's plan in a voice hollow as winter wind, afternoon work in the vegetable garden where nothing seemed to grow right, and evenings spent whittling tiny animals from scraps of wood with a knife he had found buried in the dirt behind the well. The wooden horse was his masterpiece, no bigger than his palm, but carved with all the love and longing his small hands could hold. It was chestnut brown with a flowing mane, and when the lamplight hit it just right, Timothy could almost see it running free across endless plains. Sister Margaret said possessions were vanity, but she never tried to take it from him. Perhaps even she understood that some things were too precious to surrender, too necessary for survival in a world that offered so little else. The trading post sat half a mile down the dusty path, where traveling merchants and settlers stopped to rest and resupply before continuing their journeys west. Timothy often watched them from the orphanage window, imagining where they came from and where they were bound, crafting stories of adventure and belonging that he knew would never include him. On this particular morning, the autumn air carried the promise of early snow, and Sister Margaret had sent him to trade eggs for flour with old Henrik the postmaster. The walk took him past the small grove of cottonwoods where he sometimes hid to escape the endless gray of orphanage life, where he could pretend the rustling leaves were telling him secrets about the world beyond these rolling hills. But today, the grove held something different, a sound he'd never heard before, soft and desperate, like a wounded animal calling for its mother. Timothy followed the sound deeper into the trees, his bare feet silent on the carpet of fallen leaves. What he found there stopped him cold. A young native woman, barely more than a girl herself, sat with her back against a cottonwood trunk, her breathing shallow and labored. In her arms, she held a baby, its tiny face flushed with fever, its cries weak and heartbreaking. The woman's dark eyes met Timothy's, and in them she saw a terror he recognized, the fear of being utterly alone when everything depended on you. She spoke words he couldn't understand, but her meaning was clear as clean water. The baby was dying. Timothy looked at the infant's flushed cheeks, at the way its tiny fists moved weakly through the air, and something deep in his chest cracked open like ice in spring. Without thinking, he pulled the wooden horse from his pocket and held it out to the baby. The carved toy caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, its smooth surface warm from his body heat. The baby's eyes, dark as midnight, focused on the horse with sudden interest, tiny fingers reaching toward it with instinctive curiosity. Timothy placed it carefully in the child's palm, watching his small fingers closed around it with surprising strength. The woman looked at him with something that transcended language, pure gratitude mixed with desperate hope. She pressed something into Timothy's hand, a small leather pouch that felt warm and seemed to pulse with its own life. Before he could examine it properly, she gathered her baby closer, whispered what sounded like a prayer or blessing, and disappeared deeper into the grove like morning mist touched by sunlight. Timothy stood alone among the cottonwoods, the leather pouch heavy in his palm, his pocket empty of the one thing that had ever truly belonged to him. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude, something that would change not just his life, but the fate of everyone he'd ever known. By evening, word had spread through Mercy Creek like wildfire in dry grass. Someone had seen Timothy with a native woman. Someone else claimed they'd witnessed him give aid to what they called the enemy. The facts twisted and grew with each telling until Timothy found himself facing accusations that would have been laughable if they weren't so dangerous. Sheriff Coleman arrived at the orphanage as the sun painted the western sky the color of dried blood, his boots heavy on the wooden porch, his badge catching the last light like a cold star. Sister Margaret met him at the door, her face pale as winter moon, her hands twisted in her apron. The sheriff's questions came rapid fire. What had Timothy done? Who had he spoken to? What had he given away that wasn't his to give? The other children gathered in the common room, their eyes wide with fear and fascination. Timothy stood before them all, 8 years old and straight as a fence post, telling the truth because he'd never learned to do otherwise. Yes, he'd met a woman in the grove. Yes, her baby was sick. Yes, he'd given them his wooden horse because sometimes kindness was the only medicine that mattered. Sheriff Coleman's face darkened with each admission. The woman wasn't just any native. She was the daughter of Chief Running Bear, leader of the largest tribe within 200 miles. The same Chief Running Bear who'd been negotiating a fragile peace treaty with the territorial government. The same tribe that could wipe Mercy Creek off the map if they chose to break that peace. And now this orphan boy had interfered in something far beyond his understanding. Have you subscribed to hear how this story ends? The sheriff leaned down until his face was level with Timothy's, his voice low and dangerous as distant thunder. Did the boy understand what he might have started? Did he realize that his simple act of kindness could bring war to their doorstep? But Timothy wasn't listening to threats of war or consequences beyond his control. He was thinking about the baby's fever-bright eyes, about the way its tiny fingers had grasped his wooden horse like a lifeline. He was remembering his own nights of fever and fear when sickness had taken his parents and left him with nothing but the cold charity of strangers. The leather pouch the woman had pressed into his hand now rested under his pillow, unopened and somehow sacred. Whatever was inside could wait. What mattered was that somewhere in the darkness beyond Mercy Creek, a mother was holding her child, and maybe that child was sleeping peacefully with a carved wooden horse clutched in tiny fists. Sheriff Coleman straightened, his decision made. Timothy would be confined to the orphanage until this situation resolved itself, one way or another. If the tribe came looking for trouble, they'd find the boy ready to answer for his actions. If they came looking for blood, well, that was the price of foolish compassion in a land where survival depended on knowing your place and keeping to it. Sister Margaret nodded her agreement, though Timothy saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The other children were sent to bed with whispered warnings about strangers and the dangers of trusting the wrong people. Timothy lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind test the window frames like fingers trying to find a way inside. Somewhere in that wind, he heard something else, the distant sound of drums carrying across the plains like a heartbeat in the earth itself. The drums continued through the night, growing neither louder nor softer, just maintaining their steady rhythm, like the breathing of something vast and patient. Timothy dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with painted horses and babies crying in the darkness. He woke before dawn to find Sister Margaret shaking his shoulder, her face white with fear that had nothing to do with spiritual concerns. The drums had stopped. That should have been reassuring, but somehow the silence felt even more ominous than the music had. Timothy dressed quickly and followed Sister Margaret to the common room, where the other children huddled together like sheep sensing wolves. Through the windows, they could see Sheriff Coleman and 3 of his deputies positioned around the orphanage, their rifles ready, their eyes scanning the horizon for movement that hadn't come yet but felt inevitable as sunrise. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the empty prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. Empty, that is, until it wasn't. They appeared like spirits materializing from the earth itself, dozens of riders emerging from the mist as if the dawn had given them birth. At their head rode a figure Timothy recognized even at distance, an elder whose silver hair caught the early light, whose presence commanded respect from every horse and rider around him. Chief Running Bear had come to Mercy Creek, and he wasn't alone. The rhythmic thunder of hooves against hard earth announced their approach like the drumbeat of destiny itself, growing louder with each passing moment until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the orphanage. Sheriff Coleman shouted orders to his men, but his voice carried the tremor of a man who knew he was vastly outnumbered. The children pressed against the windows, their breath fogging the glass as they watched the riders arrange themselves in a wide circle around the orphanage. Not an attack formation. Timothy had heard enough war stories to know that much, but something else entirely, something that looked almost ceremonial. The elder at their head raised his hand, and every horse stopped as one, their riders sitting motionless as carved figures while the morning breeze stirred the feathers in their hair and the fringe on their clothing. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the creak of leather saddles and the soft snorting of horses. Chief Running Bear's eyes, dark as creek water and twice as deep, swept across the orphanage until they found the window where Timothy stood. Even through the glass and distance, their gazes met and held, and Timothy felt something pass between them that had nothing to do with words or treaties or the fear that filled every other face around him. The chief reached into something wrapped in deerskin, his movements careful and deliberate, while Sheriff Coleman's knuckles went white on his rifle stock. What do you think the chief pulled from that bundle? And in that moment, with the morning sun climbing higher and the mist finally clearing completely, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether this day would end in violence or something far more unexpected. The standoff stretched until Timothy thought his heart might burst from the tension. And then Chief Running Bear did something that made Sheriff Coleman's jaw drop open like a gate with broken hinges. The elder dismounted, his feet touching the earth with reverence, and began walking toward the orphanage. Not the stride of a warrior coming to take vengeance, but the careful steps of a grandfather approaching something precious and fragile. In his hands, he carried the deerskin bundle, and with each step, Timothy could see that the chief's weathered face wasn't set in lines of anger, but something else entirely. Something that looked remarkably like tears. Sheriff Coleman raised his rifle. "That's far enough, Chief. State your business or turn around and ride out." The elder stopped 10 paces from the porch, close enough now that Timothy could see the intricate beadwork on his ceremonial shirt, close enough to see that his eyes were indeed bright with unshed tears. When Chief Running Bear spoke, his English was careful and precise, each word chosen like stones selected for a sacred cairn. "I come not as war chief, but as grandfather. I come to find the white child who saved the life of my grandson." The words hit the air like thunder in a clear sky, And suddenly, every assumption, every fear, every threat that had filled the night with darkness crumbled like old paper in flame. Timothy felt his knees go weak as understanding crashed over him like a river in spring flood. The baby with fever-bright eyes, the one whose tiny fingers had clutched his wooden horse, that child was Chief Running Bear's own grandson. The woman in the grove hadn't been a random wanderer, but the chief's daughter, and Timothy's simple act of kindness had saved not just any baby, but the future of an entire tribe. Sheriff Coleman's rifle slowly lowered as the implications sank in, and Sister Margaret's hand found Timothy's shoulder, squeezing gently as if to anchor him to the earth. Chief Running Bear continued, his voice carrying across the morning air with the authority of wind across water. My daughter tells me a small white boy with kind eyes gave his most precious possession to heal her son. The spirits heard his gift, and the fever broke before dawn. My grandson lives because of the heart of this child. He unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing not weapons or threats, but gifts that gleamed like captured sunlight. A carved eagle feather mounted in silver, a small bow crafted from the finest wood, a pair of moccasins beaded with patterns that seemed to tell stories in thread and color. But the most beautiful gift was the one he held up last. Timothy's wooden horse, but transformed. Where once it had been simple carved wood, now it was decorated with tiny silver bridle and saddle, its mane embedded with small turquoise stones that caught the light like drops of captured sky. A toy given in love should return dressed in honor, Chief Running Bear said, his eyes finding Timothy's face again. Will the boy who saved my grandson accept the gratitude of my people? Timothy stepped forward, his legs unsteady but his purpose clear. The leather pouch the woman had given him still rested in his pocket, and now he understood what it must contain. With trembling fingers, he pulled it out and opened it, revealing a small piece of turquoise carved in the shape of a horse, its surface smooth and warm from his body heat. A gift freely given, returned with interest beyond measure. The boy who had awakened that morning as an orphan with nothing but broken dreams suddenly found himself at the center of something magnificent and unprecedented. Chief Running Bear knelt on one knee, bringing himself to Timothy's eye level, and the gesture was so unexpected that even the chief's own warriors shifted in their saddles with surprise. In my tribe, the elder said softly, we believe that when a child shows such courage and kindness, he becomes family to all who witness it. You are no longer without people, young one. You are grandson to me, brother to my warriors, son to my tribe. He placed the transformed wooden horse in Timothy's hands, and the weight of it seemed to carry all the love and craftsmanship of a people who understood the true value of gifts freely given. Timothy's throat was too tied for words, but he managed to nod, and in that simple gesture was acceptance of something far greater than he'd ever imagined possible. Sister Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks with the corner of her apron, and even Sheriff Coleman seemed to have forgotten about rifles and territorial disputes in the face of something that transcended all such earthly concerns. The other children pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched their fellow orphan receive honors that most men would never dream of earning. But Chief Running Bear wasn't finished. He stood and turned to address the entire gathering, his voice carrying with the authority of wind across endless plains. Let it be known from this day forward that this child stands under the protection of our tribe. Any who would harm him must first face the wrath of Running Bear's people. Any who would help him will find favor in our eyes. He gestured to his warriors, and they dismounted as one, each approaching with their own small gift. A carved flute from a young brave, a leather pouch decorated with porcupine quills from another, a small knife in a beaded sheath from a third. Each gift was accompanied by a few words in their native tongue, and though Timothy couldn't understand the language, he heard the warmth and acceptance in their voices. This wasn't just ceremony, it was adoption, inclusion, the transformation of a lonely orphan into a child with more family than he'd ever dared to dream of having. Sister Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaken but clear. "Chief Running Bear, this boy has been in our care since his parents died of fever 3 years ago. We've tried to provide for him, but we are poor and have little to offer beyond food and shelter." The chief nodded gravely. "The boy may stay where his heart finds peace, but he will never again want for anything. Each season, my people will bring gifts. Each year, he may visit our camp and learn our ways if he chooses. He is bridge between our worlds now, living proof that kindness builds stronger bonds than treaties written on white man's paper." As the sun climbed higher and the morning transformed from gray uncertainty to golden promise, something unprecedented unfolded in the dusty space between the orphanage and the prairie. What had begun as a confrontation became a celebration. What had started with fear bloomed into joy. The native warriors shared food from their travels with the children of the orphanage, and Sister Margaret brought out what little she had to contribute to the impromptu feast. Sheriff Coleman put away his rifle and found himself in conversation with Chief Running Bear about hunting and weather and the kind of practical matters that men discuss when they're not busy being afraid of each other. Timothy sat in the center of it all, his wooden horse catching the sunlight in his lap, surrounded by gifts and new family, and the absolute certainty that his life had just taken a turn towards something beautiful and unexpected. The other children clustered around him, their own loneliness temporarily forgotten in the wonder of witnessing such a transformation. Even the most cynical among them couldn't deny that they were seeing something magical, something that would become a story told for generations. Would you have had the courage to give away your only treasure to help a stranger's child? Because as Timothy learned that morning, sometimes the things we release with love come back to us transformed, carrying more beauty than we ever imagined possible. But this was only the beginning of a bond that would defy generations and rewrite the history of an entire region. Chief Running Bear mounted his horse as the sun reached its zenith, but before departing, he made one final promise. "Each year when the leaves turn colors like these," he said, gesturing to Timothy's turquoise horse, "my people will return. We will bring news of how our grandson grows strong, and we will see how our adopted son fares among the whites. This orphanage stands now under our protection, and all who dwell here are welcome in our camp." As the riders departed, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that caught the afternoon light like powdered gold, Timothy understood that he'd witnessed something far more significant than a simple exchange of gifts. He'd seen how one small act of kindness could ripple outward like stones thrown in still water, creating waves that traveled far beyond their point of origin. The wooden horse in his hands was no longer just a toy. It was a symbol of connection between worlds, a reminder that compassion recognizes no boundaries of race or culture or circumstance. In a land where differences often led to conflict, one orphan boy had proven that similarities ran deeper than surface divisions, that the love of a parent for their child was a universal language that everyone could understand. And in the years that followed, as Chief Running Bear kept his promise and the orphanage prospered under tribal protection, Timothy would often hold his transformed horse and remember the morning when kindness had summoned more blessings than he'd ever dared to imagine. The transformation of Mercy Creek Orphanage became the stuff of legend, a story that spread across the territories like seeds on wind, taking root in the hearts of all who heard it. The annual visits from Chief Running Bear's people became festivals of friendship that drew visitors from hundreds of miles away, creating bonds between communities that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Timothy grew into a young man who spoke both English and the tongue of his adopted tribe with equal fluency, who could hunt with bow and arrow as skillfully as he could read and write, who served as translator and mediator in countless negotiations between native peoples and white settlers. But he never forgot the lesson learned that autumn morning when he'd given away his wooden horse, that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we're willing to share, and that the greatest gifts often come disguised as the simplest acts of human kindness. Sometimes a child's toy given in love can change the world. Sometimes an orphan's compassion can build bridges that span generations. And sometimes, when we release what we treasure most, it returns to us transformed into something more beautiful than we ever imagined possible. Would you have risked everything for a sick child's comfort? Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.